A fairly relaxing video compared to the other ones of this chapter. There's no big worksheets or anything. This is on Learning Objective 4, using the statement of cash flows to evaluate a company. The book talks about free cash flow. You start off with the cash provided by operating activities, and you deduct from that any capital expenditures. That would be expenditures on property, plant, and equipment to keep the current level of operations. Then you'd also deduct cash dividends, and cash dividends are paid to keep the current level of investment in the company. In other words, you pay the stockholders so they'll continue to stay invested in your company. So these two items are generally aimed at keeping the current level of operations. So once you've got your cash provided by operating activities, less the capital expenditures, less cash dividends, and that gives you the free cash flow, which is what's left over after you've maintained the current level of operating activities to expand your plant operations, to pay down debt. It's available for research and development, or to weather some bad times if they came along. So your free cash flow is an indication of the company's financial flexibility. In other words, how much extra cash do they have left over after they have maintained the current level of their operations. So so that's your basic free cash flow. And it's obviously better to have a positive free cash flow than a negative one. Okay? And that's really about what the text goes into, is what they think you should know about the statement of cash flows and how it's useful for analyzing a company. I'm going to, no extra charge, I'll tell you a little bit more about it. None of what I say from here on is on any test or anything, so you can just kind of relax, but it's probably something that would come in handy if you are ever investing, or you're needing to really understand the statement of cash flows and what it does. So the statement of cash flows is really, it's like a big bank statement. It's similar to the bank statement. You get your cash at the beginning, you get a whole list of deposits, cash that came in, cash that came out, and an ending balance. The additional information provided in the statement of cash flows is that it breaks it down into the very useful categories of operating, investing, and financing activities. So why is that useful? Well, a company can tell you all kinds of things about what its plans are and what its aspirations are and all of that, but the cash flow statement tells you what it's really doing with its money and where it's really getting its money. So it tells us how a company is getting its cash. You've got your basic, you've got your operating section and your investing section and your financing section. And I'll leave it at that for the moment. And so what it tells you is the company, if they're generating cash flow, is it from operating, or are they generating most of their cash from, maybe selling off equipment, or are they getting it all from financing? It depends, where are they getting their money? Where you would like to see them getting it is from their operating activities. Because if they're getting it from selling off equipment to pay their bills, that's not so good. If they're getting it from just issuing more stock or taking on massive amounts of debt, and they've got negative cash flows from operations, that's not so good. And these are things you can look at by scanning a statement of cash flows. They also, the second thing that the statement of cash flows tells us is how much of the net income that's reported. Now this is where we're comparing the net income to the cash provided by operating activities. Okay? If you have a very big number up here, say you've got 10 million up here, and you have got 1 million down here, that's not so good. You've got a lot of net income, but you have not got much cash. Now, how could that happen? Well, one thing that could happen is you could have a lot of accounts receivable, okay, that you have booked as revenue. Okay? So if you book a lot of accounts receivable and revenue, you've got really good assets and you've got really good revenue. However, if these accounts receivable are not going to get collected ever, as in some of the banks that had mortgages receivable, if those accounts receivable are like mortgages receivable and nobody's able to pay them off, then they're not really going to get realized in cash. So you can have very good net income or very good income reported, and your balance sheet looks great, but you have no cash. So that's one thing that could happen. If the company's net income is very different from their cash flows from operations, it means that you need to ask why. That's one possible reason. The other reason is they could be cooking their books. They could be doing what's called aggressive accounting or committing fraud. And the financial statements could be total works of fiction. So how would that be? Well, on the income statement, you have lots of estimates. And when management wants to manage its earnings, it will sometimes mess with those estimates so that you end up with a very good-looking income statement, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting the cash. One ratio that's pretty handy is what's called the cash flow yield, and this compares your net income. It takes your cash flow from operating activities, that's your cash provided by operating activities, and it divides it by net income. Okay, so if you have cash flow from operating activities of 10 and your net income is 4, then you would divide that out and it comes to 2.5, and that's okay. You've got a lot more cash flow from operating activities and it's above your net income. However, if it's the other way around and you've got your cash flow from operating activities is 4 and your net income is 10, you've got a higher net income than is generating the cash, so you've got 0.4 as a cash flow yield. And so that's you generally want this number to be 1 or better. Okay, so that's kind of an ideal. Can companies manipulate the cash flow statement to get better results? They can. Ask Krispy Kreme Donuts. They did it. Of course, they got in big trouble. They misclassified a lot of operating items as investing just to make their cash flow statement look a little better. It didn't work out well. They did not have a happy ending. Also, I mean, management can do things like postpone capital expenditures to make it look a little better. And, there's kind of a fine line between, that you don't want to cross there. Okay, in the notes to the financial statements, and I'm not going to write the whole thing out, but I have a cash flow statement in the 2008 financial meltdown, and this is Lehman Brothers cash flows. And if people had been looking at their cash flow statement, they would have probably seen what was coming, because their net income, if you look at 2005, it was $32.60, and then in 2006 it was up, it was higher. In 2007 it was higher still. So that's kind of a nice income trend they were showing. The only problem is, look at what was going on with their cash flow from operating activities. They were generating negative cash of $12.205 million. Okay, these are all in millions. And by 2007, that trend was just getting ridiculously awful. They're generating huge amounts of negative cash flow. And they were in this situation where they had a lot of the mortgages receivable, and when the economy went down, they weren't collecting any of that in cash. You'll notice that their cash flow from financing activities, they were using cash flow from financing activities to cover their operations. So they were borrowing almost as much as they were losing on their operations. So that's where the cash flow statement can tell you a lot about a company, because they're certainly not going to tell you about it, unless they have to. Okay, so cash flow statement, you don't use it alone, you use it in conjunction with the other financial statements when you're looking at how a company is doing. And there's just a few basic things you'll look at to see if you need to know more about a company that you're trying to figure out how they're doing, okay? So you do the cash flow yield, you see where they're getting their, where they're really getting their money. And those two things alone are pretty good to know.